And our next two speakers are from the Maine Department of Environmental Protection. And they're going to talk about some updates around Bluff stabilization. We're going to start with Alison Sirios, who is in the Bureau of Land Resources and is the Regional Licensing and Compliance Manager at DEP's Southern Maine office. Thank you, Alison.
Thank you. So I have a quick question for everyone. Who has done a permit before through the DEP? A few of you. How many of you live on a lot that has an unstable bluff? A lot of you. More of you. Okay. Great. So I'm going to be talking about the permitting process. So it's going to be a lot of words and it's going to be less pictures, but hopefully by the end of this you'll get an idea of what we'll allow under the Natural Resources Protection Act. In 1987, the Natural Resources Protection Act was enacted by the state legislature, who found that the state's rivers and streams, great ponds, fragile mountain areas, freshwater wetlands, significant wildlife habitat, coastal wetlands, and coastal sand dune systems are resources of state significance that should be protected by law. Coastal wetlands are defined as the area located below the debris line left by tidal action, any area of salt-tolerant vegetation, any area below the maximum spring tide elevation, including rocky coast and salt marsh. All coastal wetlands are considered wetlands of special significance. For an activity proposed in, on, or over wetlands of special significance, a practicable alternative less damaging to the environment is considered to exist, and the impact is unreasonable except for certain activities. Shoreline stabilization are considered one of those activities pursuant to Chapter 310. So here we are, a project involving soil disturbance, wetland fill, or alteration in, on, over, or in some cases adjacent to a coastal wetland, generally requires permit approval under the NRPA, Natural Resources Protection Act. Oh, I don't need to. Oh. Okay, so where are we talking about? So everyone knows that the intertidal is protected, but we're talking about our NRPA's jurisdiction starts at the highest annual tide line, measured back 75 feet. So any activity that you propose within that area is going to require permitting for the most part. There are exceptions to that, but I'm not going to talk about those exceptions. For most of you, the activities you're going to be pursuing, if you want to deal with your unstable bluffs, is going to require some permitting. Okay, so there are two types of NRPA permits. And the NRPA permit by rule is the simpler form of the permit. It's limited in terms of what you can do under a NRPA permit by rule for shore stabilization. Generally, there are things you can do in the coastal wetlands that require other types of permit by rule that are allowed. But if we're just talking about shoreline stabilization, there are three things. One more question I had for all of you. How many of you have riprap or a seawall already on your property? Okay, a few of you. So you can use a permit by rule to replace over 50% of that seawall or riprap in kind in the same footprint with a permit by rule. You can do vegetative buffers and plantings within 75 feet of the hat with a permit by rule. And then any soil disturbance greater than 25 feet out from the hat out to 75 feet, you can use a permit by rule. Otherwise, you're already into an individual NRPA permit. Those permits are a little more extensive, and I'm going to talk about some of the standards that are required that you need to address in your permit process for us to make a positive finding and for a project to move forward. Things like changes in dimensions of existing structures, and structures would be your seawall or your riprap, would require an individual NRPA permit application, and then soil disturbance, fill, alteration in, on, over, adjacent to the resource. So NRPA standards, the legislature, under the Natural Resource Protection Act statute, there are potential impacts from shoreline stabilization that need to be addressed in a NRPA application. let's see. So specific to historic methods of stabilization along the coast, riprap and seawalls mostly, which are hard armoring, the following standards and potential impacts to those standards need to be addressed. And the four I'm going to focus on right now, I will back up and say that the department is in the spirit of resiliency and also in the knowing that the permitting process, like cliffs or bluffs, don't change quickly. We are trying to address more ways in which you can implement some of these greener hybrid structures along the coast. But to do that, we need to address some of the standards, and we're kind of shifting to look at, even though we do already have to make a positive finding to these standards when we approve an individual permit, we're sort of shifting towards addressing some of these things that Pete has brought up in terms of specific to coastal bluffs and unstable bluffs. The first is the standard of harm to habitats and fisheries. When you fill a coastal wetland, aquatic habitat is lost. When you fill or change the upland habitat, vegetation is removed. All of those things affect habitats and aquatic habitats. The second, also, when you're armoring the shoreline with hard armoring, there is no sediment transfer between the bluff and the beaches, the mud flats. And that is something that we need to be able to, in your application, be able to look at and say, you know, you're doing the best you can to continue that process happening. Flooding of adjacent properties, that is another thing that we need to be able to look at your application submission and say that you know, because of water and wave reflection, you're not going to be impacting your neighbors. And then also scenic and aesthetic impacts. If you're putting a lot of riprap up that's completely wiping out your bluff, it's also going to become a visual and aesthetic thing that we also need to make a finding on. So the department reviews an application to assess the reasonableness of the proposed impacts by considering the degree of harm to the resource, the degree of benefit from the activity, and the necessity of the activity to protect threatened structures. An application is a description of the activity and a justification of the proposed design of that activity. The applicant is expected to minimize impacts to the greatest extent practicable. Key considerations for a coastal shoreline stabilization project or application should include discussions about sediment supply to adjacent habitats, scale of the project, amount of direct impacts below the hat line, above the hat line, and within 75 feet, amount of direct impacts to adjacent habitats, marine resources, wildlife, salt marsh and seagrass or eelgrass, amount and quality of vegetation removal in the upland. So for us to be able to evaluate that, we turn to our partners like MGS, Pete Slavinsky and his colleague Nick, IFNW and Department of Marine Resources, who will review the application and with that in mind start giving comments to the applicants and to provide those to us so that we can actually work with the applicant to create a design that is more habitat friendly and also minimizing impacts. So some of the things you need in an individual NERP application include, this is a list, this is not exhaustive, but this is specifically geared towards submittal for a shoreline stabilization project that might be a hybrid project that actually might consider more green infrastructure methods than gray methods. So for every project, you need to provide a project purpose. And to do that for this type of project, we want to see evidence of erosion, active erosion caused by wave action. This would include evidence of undercutting or slumping at the toe of the slope or rotational failure caused by undercutting. We want to talk, it would be great if we had a submission. My colleague Nate is going to be talking about the Our Shores checklist resource. That'd be great if with your application you provided some results from doing that checklist before, or at least knowing what those issues are for upland management and addressing them. And if it's a stable bluff, we would want to provide, you'd want to provide more evidence of erosion over time versus one single event. So in terms of an alternatives analysis, which is also something that we will require from an application, we will want to see why a softer technique can't be implemented with a harder technique. And we would want to see that as actually an alternative that comes in. So for the projects and demonstration sites that Tim and Dan just showed, we want to see those sorts of projects coming in and all the things that they have described, like cutting the back of the slope to a lesser slope, plantings, and more of a general toe slope in higher velocity areas with riprap instead of armoring the whole shore or the whole face of the bluff. And then design recommendations, again, I think I'm just repeating a lot of what these guys have already said, is 10-foot wide vegetative buffer with any work that you do, and even more if you can. If you can give up some of the developed area and the lawn above, that would be much more looked upon as more resilient, but also in the permitting process, we'd be able to make a more positive finding for the standards, towards meeting the standards under the NERPA. Let's see. So additional recommendations, every applicant has to minimize and avoid as part of the NERPA process. So designs, we'd want to limit impacts below the hat line. Anything over 500 square feet below hat requires compensation, which means you'll have to pay for every square foot because of the protections that we have in those habitats. Also, design should not exceed the areas of active erosion with consideration for transitioning to non-eroding areas. So that's something where we're not encouraging folks to armor their whole bluff if there's not erosion happening. Transitioning maybe from a more eroded area, I think Tim showed a good example where they used quars and anchors versus riprap in the different sections of shoreline. I think that's a very thoughtful and good way to approach instead of a standard riprap process. Length of the stabilization should be limited to the portion seaward of any threatened structures. So that's another thing. We take it pretty seriously that folks' structures, potentially from the past couple storms, there's been huge risk, and erosion. And we do want to prioritize those structures so that, folks can feel comfortable. And also that's going to be a higher priority area to stabilize. Also, biodegradable materials, quar logs in coastal wetlands will be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. So I put this one in here only because we're getting to a place where I think restoring salt marsh below the bluffs is going to be a pretty important part of the process. But at this point, we're considering we have certain rules under the NERPA that says fill. After so much fill, you have to compensate. But in terms of restoring habitat, that is something that, in terms of the laws and rules, we will be approaching, I think, more and more in a positive way. So how can I slow erosion off my bluff? Well, Nate's going to tell you a little bit about that. And then I think the key thing that I hope one of the takeaway here, if you don't want to experience a big failure is to start to vegetate. Think about vegetating your bluff. Think about taking away some of the lawn, vegetating with trees, shrubs, things that have real root systems that can secure the bluff in a better way. Let's see. So I'm going to quickly talk about some of the legislation that, like I said, rules and regulations don't change quickly. And I bring this one up, LD 471, an act to improve coastal sand dune restoration projects, because what this the statute change did was to introduce biodegradable, a definition for biodegradable materials, which now can be used in different systems where it currently couldn't. Sand dunes, specifically, where folks who don't have any kind of hard structures in front of their dunes, in their dune systems, can now do something of a hybrid that's biodegradable to create a dune in front of their homes so that they have some protections. This definition, the other thing this law did was also provide the opportunity for folks to utilize dredge material from some of the federal and state dredges and to create dune systems and back dunes and front dunes with that material. The reason I bring this up is because in the next legislative session, the department is proposing to, it's in draft form now. Not many have seen it because it's going through the review process, but a PBR for coastal stabilization. And the hope is that the biodegradable materials will be used. Here are the criteria that will come into play, but my time is up, and I guess we'll have questions. Oh, one thing I did want to mention is I do have a few staff that are in the audience today, and if you want to raise your hands, guys. Right back there. So if you have questions and I can't answer them all, please seek out one of my staff.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Allison. Next up, Allison's colleague at Maine DEP, Nathan Robbins, who's their climate change specialist. He's currently supporting an initiative to facilitate climate resilient investments that prioritize natural solutions. So with that, Nathan.
Nice to see everybody this morning, late morning. Thanks for the introduction. I'm going to jump in, and thanks to Allison for setting this up for success. That's a lot of tough technical language to go through. What I'm going to talk about today is the RSHOR program, which is a new program that we've been developing to assist property owners assess and determine potential living shoreline or hybrid solutions for their property. We're taking a statewide approach to this issue. Maine has a lot of freshwater resources, lakes, rivers. We have millions of acres of wetlands and coastal wetlands, and of course thousands of miles of coastline. And we have, of course, a history of development along these coastlines. So the challenge with living by these shorelines, of course, is the inherent risk of coastal flooding or riverine flooding, lake flooding, both from the water side and the overland side. And, just looking at a couple of the pictures here in the upper left, that's 30 years ago in this area. We had 19 inches of rain in 1996, was a record for the region. That's Westbrook. We have Patriots Day storm down in the bottom left. And then the other three pictures are just from this last winter, from December and January storms. Everybody else has done a great job. You've talking about this picture, so I don't have to go too much into this, but I think the takeaway is there's a lot of different factors that cause erosion, and the way that we've been thinking about this is how to address the entire site, because erosion can come from the water side, it can come from the bank, and it can come from the upland side. And so there are different practices that can be used, and often in combination, to more holistically treat that shoreline and decrease the risk of erosion. If you look up living shorelines, you might come across this figure pretty quickly. This is from NOAA, and it's a green to gray spectrum. For the topic today, I took the liberty of adapting this and only going to green-gray, and I drew some vegetation on revetments and on bulkheads, which is more just a nod to hybrid designs. And even maybe when thinking about riprap seawalls, or is there an opportunity to retrofit those with vegetation? The other part that I think that is worth adapting on this is that green is called softer techniques and gray is called harder techniques. But one of the things that we're learning is that living shorelines can get stronger over time, and riprap can sometimes get weaker over time. So it's important to think about those factors when you're considering your design. Sometimes soft isn't necessarily soft. It may actually become more resilient over time. And so here's a couple of examples of that, just focusing on the bank portion. On the left here, you have a stabilization project. This was on a river here in Maine, and you can see they were pursuing the design with a sort of hybrid riprap to vegetation on the top, and then they changed the design further down the bank to fully vegetative. This is a 10-year-old project, and you can see that the green-gray as well as the fully green worked in that standpoint. And then over on the right is another example of riprap. This is on the coast, and or a fully vegetative. And so the takeaway for me on this is that green or green-gray can be as strong as gray. And the other part that builds on what Alison was talking about is that green or green-gray designs work within our regulatory structure in Maine under the Natural Resources Protection Act, because they can minimize thermal impact by cooling that water down and cooling and just not having all that rock interacting and heating up with the water, which is good for habitat and species. It doesn't destroy habitat. You have species connectivity from the upland to the lowland, or to the water, and you can dissipate that energy deflection, so both in the nearshore environment, but also to adjacent properties. And again, structures can degrade over time if they're not maintained. And that's another point that was mentioned before. Looking at vegetated buffers, and that's been talked about a lot, so sort of moving up onto the site now and addressing all those different factors. This picture on the left was damage from the last storm. So in this case, water came up and overtopped that bulkhead and caused the erosion from the back and the failure. So, and you can see a similar issue that happened on the right. So to me, this really speaks to what can vegetation do to prevent that from happening, and having, again, green work with gray. So that really brings us to this project that we've been working on the last couple of years, which is, we're calling Our Shore, which is an acronym, and I'll explain in the next few slides what that means. The idea is that we've been looking at the different practices for living shorelines, both being used inland and on the coast, and tried to understand what types of energy environments do they work in, and try to get that information available for people to actually assess their own site and look at the solutions that might minimize and be effective for performance in terms of a shoreline stabilization project. So this is we started with a checklist, and we have these goals and objectives, which again have really been talked about. I think Tim mentioned looking at neighboring sites and looking at vegetation. Well, that's part of the goals here. Is it starts by observing and blending the design with what's already there, looking at the species that are already there and what's working, trying to promote that. and enhance that. And then thinking about the site long-term in terms of reaching conditions that will function as a naturalized shoreline over time. So those are the big picture goals. And in order to get there, we created this ways to assess the instability of that site. And it uses the acronym SHORE. So you look at the source and severity of the erosion, the height and slope of risk, the overland water and land use, and then you look at vegetation or revegetation of that. And you'll see it's green to red. So the different factors here, you would go through and you would assess low risk, medium risk, or high risks of instability as you go through each one of those sources of erosion. And from there, you would get directed to different practices. So these are a list of a lot of the types of practices that you've heard about already today. And again, those practices will sort of treat those levels of erosion risk and those sources of erosion. And so as a result of going through the checklist, you get steered towards sort of practices that might be suitable, that are either green or green-gray, but that are mostly appropriate for your specific considerations of your site. So the result might be a combination of practices. You know, it's not going to be one solution. It's going to be multiple. And we saw already presentations that showed very similar designs. You might have stones at the toe, you know, moving to core log and vegetation. Another hybrid design would be, there was already a picture earlier. This one has live stakes put into the toes, the stone at the toe. That would actually be allowed, you know, grow stronger over time. But I just want to talk about just a couple of no regret things that you could even do right now. And so this is where the permitting guidance comes in with the RShore checklist as well. We've included on the practices a little thumbs up icon that tells you which of the practices you can do without a permit at all. And these are some of them. So, you know, working in the upland is really important. And so, you know, just identifying high energy or concentrated water flows. So going out on a day like today where it's raining and looking at where water is collecting and figuring out how to slow it down and spread it out. So dissipating that energy. And then treatments for that might be increasing buffer vegetation. It could be minimizing lawns, areas near banks. It could even just be setting your mower higher and letting the grass grow higher. And then creating meanders or pathways through the buffer, but essentially just dissipating that energy from the rain, and so slowing it down before it even gets to the bank. So there's a lot of opportunities you can do that don't even require a permit. And those things are highlighted in the checklist. So plants have been talked about a lot. I just want to say we are including, we've heard that loud and clear as we've been developing this guide. There's a lot of resources out there, so rather than create a whole new resource, we just created a 2-page summary of available planting guides, and we've been asking folks who are doing this work, what are the really helpful planting guides that are out there that you would say are the go-to resources, and we've tried to distill that. And then I just want to say thanks to Ruby Treball, who has been working on Living Shorelines designs and up in the Penobscot Bay region and Blue Hill, and so she has provided just a starting list of some of her favorite plants for using Living Shorelines. And we're going to include that in the guide. And just pictures of a couple of what that can look like. And I think they're really beautiful shorelines that are working really effectively. So in the works, in addition to the checklist, we also have a more comprehensive guide that we're hoping to complete this fall. And it goes in more detail about all of the specific practices with lots of examples and pictures. It has, we're hoping to include case studies and some how-tos. So 1 or 2 page, this is how to do a live stake, or this is how you might go about doing plantings for your vegetated buffer. We're going to build out this content on our DEP webpage, and then we're going to be available for more workshops like this, or to host trainings, working with contractors, working with permitting staff at the department and our other natural resource agencies, working with municipal officials, and just doing this work together.